In this training lesson, we're going to consider what to look for when you're looking for country property. Now, this can apply to someone who's going to rent or someone who's going to buy, but the issue is, where do you go? What do you look for? We have plenty of counsel on the importance of moving out of the cities and living in the country. And so the question is, what do I look for? If I'm convicted that I need to make a move, where do I start? What do I look for? Well, like many other things, there are some significant areas to consider. Why, when, where, what, and how. We're going to take a look at these first four in this unit, and then we will look at the how another time. So I believe that the when and the why are answered in one of the more often quoted Spirit of Prophecy statements found on page 99 in Last Day Events. Again and again, the Lord has instructed that our people are to take their families away from the cities into the country. So when? Again and again, we've been told. So it's already now. Should have already been doing it. So the when is now. Why? Where we can raise our own provisions, for in the future the problem of buying and selling will be a very serious one. So when is now, and why is because we need to be independent of the system of having to pull our wallet out to buy our needs. And in this case, she mentions having a garden so that you don't have to buy food. And I believe firmly that if she were alive today, she would be adding other things that we are now dependent upon. And I have recommended and continue to recommend that you do like I did and analyze your personal life and say, if I couldn't buy or sell, what in my lifestyle would I be in trouble of the basic necessities of life? And you'll probably find that, like I did, that everything was in trouble. Every single thing that I did when I lived in the city, I had to pull my wallet out. So what I've done, our family has done, is we've analyzed our life and we have attempted to have a backup plan in place for all of the things that we currently pull our wallet out for. And obviously a garden is a major piece of that. So Ellen White says in Country Living, page 18, fathers and mothers who possess a piece of land and a comfortable home are kings and queens. Notice she doesn't say own, she says possess. So this is not just counsel for someone who is buying and has the resources to do that, but it is also for a person who would be renting. So the first question we're going to look at then is where in the world? And I feel there's no better resource for giving tools to analyze that than a book by Joel Skousen called Strategic Relocation. Joel Skousen, for many decades, was a consultant to architects of the rich and famous, designing a hidden space in these new homes for security and for safety. And so if there was some rich person wanting to build a home, Joel would work with the architect and incorporate in the house plans a safe room within the house that would not be known to the person visiting. It's concealed and it's secure. He went to great lengths to make it attack proof as well as nuclear fallout proof. Well, when Y2K came along at the turn of the millennium, there was great concern by many people about their own safety and being self-sustaining. So many people came to Joel Skousen because of his background and his expertise and said, where's the best place for me to live? Well, that got him and his son working collaboratively to do research in depth as to answering that question, and resulted in this book. My son-in-law and I have had the privilege of attending two of his seminars in person, and he's very knowledgeable in this kind of thing. So in the book, the first section backs away and looks at the whole world and basically different regions of the world and where would be the best place for you to consider. Now, if you are a English-speaking white Caucasian from America, then the thing that jumped out to me is that it's not advisable, in his opinion, for you to be taking the position like many what are called expatriates, expats. Those are American citizens who live outside the country. I have personal friends who fit that category. One of them lives in Canada because he's uncomfortable with the way things are going in the United States. And another couple moved many decades ago to Costa Rica for similar concerns, and then ultimately to the Panama. And Joel Skousen's opinion is that's a dangerous thing to do, particularly if it is a Central and South American location as compared to Canada. And the reason is that if I lived in Mexico, for instance, I could live beyond my financial abilities in the United States because of the dollar being worth more down there. I could live more financially set up, but I don't look like a Mexican. I don't speak like a Mexican. Even if I know Spanish well, I would have an accent that would single me out. So you're always seen as a foreigner, and that's fine while the world is in good shape. But we have seen with many regimes that there can be a hostile takeover of the government, and all of a sudden the people that are not local are considered expendable, and you could end up not blending in because you don't look and talk like them, so you can't hide, and your assets are at risk because the regime could take, they've done it before, they could take your assets, they could take your money out of the bank, and you could be destitute and in the wrong country. So he doesn't recommend doing that if you are an American citizen that's white and Caucasian. An example of that is a friend of mine who was the building inspector in our area. I went to the building office one time to say hi to him, and they said, "Oh, he's not here anymore." And I said, "Well, what happened to him?" He said, "Well, he moved to Belize." Now, Belize is an English-speaking Central American country. A lot of Americans like that for a couple of reasons. And he had gone on vacation there and fallen in love with a local gal and decided he wanted to just pack it up and move down there. Well, as I was told, the rules were that you had to be local to own the properties. So he sold his assets up here and sent the money to his girlfriend to buy the house that they agreed to live in. And then he quit his job and he went to Belize. And when he got there to his house, his girlfriend and her boyfriend came to the door and basically said, "Who are you?" And as far as I know, he's probably on a street corner in Belize selling hats. So it could even happen before you even get set up, the risks. So then Joel Skousen looks at North America. Um, Joel Skousen's book then looks at primary threats. The first one is active volcanoes, and we live in the Northwest, and so we're very aware of Mount St. Helens and the impact that had on life. Matter of fact, our daughter was born the day of the second eruption. And then Joel Skousen also looks at strategic nuclear targets. And what really surprised me from his book is that North Dakota and Montana have a lot of red on it. And I thought, why in the world? That's wide open country over there. Why would those be nuclear targets? I mean, we've got quite a few military kind of targets plus Boeing in Western Washington. I could see that, but I couldn't understand Montana and North Dakota. Well, if the Russians decide to send a nuclear missile, they're going to go over the North Pole. And Montana and North Dakota are the closest to the border to be able to defend ourselves. So now that makes sense. And then this is expanding that to the Northwest where we live, and it not only shows nuclear targets and potential volcanoes, but it also shows population density. And he recommends, as does Ellen White, that you get away from the population base and get away from all the troubles that you would have with high density population. Then he looks at the different regions and states and grades them based on all these different characteristics that he has analyzed. Now, some of the ones that he analyzes are the weather. For instance, you look at this picture and you go, wow, that's a beautiful spot. I would love to live there. Well, maybe. It depends. You can see the snow on the mountains. So this is probably maybe in Canada, up in the mountains. It's probably really cold there, even though it might be late spring. You might say, well, I want to go to the south. I want to be in Arizona, where it's always sunny. Well, but then what about water? Are you going and you don't have a lot of potential for greenery if you don't have water and so forth. We talked about earthquakes. The ring of fire around the Pacific Ocean is just active all the time with earthquakes. We all know about the San Andreas Fault in California, but there's also the Pacific Northwest is probably just as vulnerable of having an offshore shift in the plates and creating an earthquake and a tidal wave, a tsunami, that by some scientists' estimate will wipe out everything west of I-5. Another thing to consider is terrain. You look at this picture again, you'd say, wow, this is really nice. Well, not only are you cold next to the water, but if you were up on that hill, it'd be pretty hard to grow things. You need to consider the terrain. It's also suggested you look at the local economy. For instance, you want to have an economy that's not just destitute, so you can have a way to make a living, but at the same time, you don't want to be where it's really expensive. One person's opinion is if you go out on a county road and you find a pothole that hasn't been fixed for a while, that's a good sign, because that means your taxes are low and the government doesn't have the resources to quickly fix the potholes. And it probably means you don't have as much governmental regulations telling you what to do and what you can't do. Now, that's something that has as a two-edged sword. My brother lives in northeast Washington state, where at the time there wasn't any requirement for building permits, and his property had a septic system that had been put in without a permit because it wasn't required. When he went to sell the property, even though the permits weren't required, the bank would not approve the loan without the permit. So he had to dig up his yard to expose the drain fields so the inspector could inspect it and sign off so he could sell the place. We already talked about foreign relocation and the risks of that. Another thing that's ideal to look for is accessibility to public and private land. So for instance, if you happen to be near or backed up against timberland or government Forest Service land, that would be really ideal. We talked about nuclear fallout. If there is a nuclear detonation, the target has been hit. What happens is that the debris, you've seen the mushroom clouds, that goes up really fast, it goes up really high. Well, what's going up is a cloud of debris that got hit with the nuclear blast. There's usually a crater in the ground. So you've got rock and buildings and all kinds of stuff, little pieces that are now up in the air, and they're all radioactive. And the wind will blow that cloud. When Mount St. Helens blew, the ash from Mount St. Helens went around the world 3 times before it all fell out of the sky. So a nuclear bomb, if you're in the blast zone, you're going to be killed instantly. If you're 20 miles away and you're in the direction where the wind goes, then that nuclear fallout will be coming your way and be falling out of the sky like snow. And each particle is radioactive. So nuclear considerations, military targets, Pacific Northwest, Western Washington. We've got, well, Eastern Washington, we have Hanford Nuclear Reservation where they created the fuel for the atomic bombs. We've got in Western Washington, we used to live, when we lived in the city, we were 20 miles from Fort Lewis McChord Air Force Base, Fort Lewis Army Base. Many of our neighbors were military, and so we were just sitting duck. And Western Washington has the Bangor Nuclear Submarine Base. It's got um, Naval Air Station at Oak Harbor. There's all kinds of things that are military. So you need to consider that, and that they would be a potential target. And in the case of Washington, you've got Boeing plant, which makes military airplanes and stuff, and so that could be a target as well. And you might think, oh, hey, I know, I'll go to Arizona, I'll live in Phoenix area, out of Phoenix. Well, guess what? The helicopters for Boeing are made in Mesa. So you need to know where these things are if you're going to have that as one of your considerations. Then there are local considerations on one of his charts, and I picked Washington because that's where we live. And it shows you different things besides what we've talked about, such as Indian land, Forest Service land, national parks, state parks, and so forth. Now, the problem is this book isn't printed anymore. So if you want to buy the book, you're stuck with a secondhand purchase. And you can see from this that it runs from $85 to $144 at the time that I looked. Fortunately, Joel Skousen on his website, joelskousen.com, has the book in digital form for sale for just $15. It's a third of the price of what it was when it was in print. So this is really good. You can download it on your computer as a PDF file and see it in color and everything. So I highly recommend this. It's well worth $15. One last thing about Joel Skousen is I found online Daniel Vitalis has a podcast interview show, and he interviewed Joel Skousen a number of times, I believe. But this one here, if you go to danielvitalis.com and search for Joel Skousen, you'll find that he did an interview with him. And or you can hit pause right now and write down this address or type it in your computer. When you get there, I recommend you skip the first 17 minutes because it's kind of an advertisement and a long introduction. But after that, it's some really good stuff.
And now we're going to benefit from another person's recommendations about looking for that ideal country property.
What to look for in a country property. Location, location, location. This is a very idyllic kind of a setting here, although as you can tell from the rugged background that it's probably not the most practical as far as being able to sustain oneself, and nor is access necessarily completely accessible. This may be a place where you may live at some point, but as far as being able to raise your own produce and sustain a family, this may not be the place, but it may be what comes to mind. So think sustainable preparedness when you're preparing a place or looking for a place to purchase. Being able as much as possible to be independent of the systems of the world for an extended period of time. Not having to go outside of your resources to do that. And being prepared not only to aid brothers and sisters in Christ, but also other seekers in time of distress. Your neighbors, people around who may be looking for a place to move away from the dangerous scenarios that may be occurring in more urban areas. So those could be social, economic, or natural disaster kinds of scenarios. So this could look different for each individual person, so do bear that in mind. A great book from which many of the ideas have come from is called Sustainable Preparedness by Craig, Nancy, and Nick Meisner. I've done some sustainable preparedness expos that brought in various vendors and presenters from all across the country in urban areas to teach these concepts. So the book is called Sustainable Preparedness and goes and walks you through many of the different topics that in detail that we talk about here. Number one, the first step is to actually prepare your heart. Ask God, go to Scripture, let God lead you. Psalm 91 says, "He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God. In Him will I trust." It could very well be that the place that we're thinking about, a country living property, may not be where we spend most of our time, because there's a possibility that we may be taken against our will to places that we don't expect, and we need to trust in Him. And He is our refuge. Our refuge may not be necessarily a physical place, but in the spiritual realm of trusting and relying upon God wherever we are. Paul said that wherever I am, I can be content, whether it be in prison or in the lofty hills. So do keep that in mind. Number two, be open to God's leading. What were the conditions chosen by the infinite Father for His Son? A secluded home in the Galilean hills, a household sustained by honest, self-respecting labor, a life of simplicity, daily conflict with difficulty and hardship, self-sacrifice, economy, and patient, gladsome service, the hour of study at his mother's side with the open scroll of Scripture, the quiet dawn or twilight in the green valley, the holy ministries of nature, the study of creation and providence, and the soul's communion with God. These were the conditions and opportunities of the early life of Jesus. Ministry of Healing 365 and 366. Get out of the cities as soon as possible and purchase a little piece of land where you can have a garden, where your children can watch the flowers growing and learn from the lessons of simplicity and purity from Selected Messages, Volume 2, page 356. So we're directed to move out into a setting that is surrounded by nature, that allows us to have the serenity that the city cannot afford. So Abraham was told to go, and he went, even without a place that he actually knew of where he was going. So many times we are just told to go, and we need to be obedient to God's living. He will open the way as we obey Him. The Lord calls for His people to locate away from the cities. Fathers and mothers who possess a piece of land and a comfortable home are kings and queens. The Lord would have His people looking about them and securing humble, inexpensive places as centers for their work, and from time to time larger places will come to their notice, which they will be able to secure at a surprisingly low price. Faith, hope, love, happiness can far better be gained in retired places where there are fields and hills and trees. Adventist Home 137. Again and again the Lord is instructed into the country where they can raise their own provisions, for in the future the problem of buying and selling will be a very serious one. Into rural districts, houses not crowded closely together, free from the interference of enemies. So some of the places that you want to look for are places where you don't have crowded homes close together, where those who may not be favorable of activities that you may be participating in or doing should not be just breathing down your neck. So free from the interference of enemies. So the basics, step 3, shelter. So it says a comfortable home, not necessarily an expensive home. Could even be a mobile unit, something that could get you started on a piece of property. Water, could be running water, a spring, or a well with access by a pump. The ability to grow food, maybe look for some existing fruit trees or a garden space. You don't want to have steep property that wouldn't be conducive to gardening and food production, nor would you want to be just deep in the dark woods because you wouldn't have the sun access. A south-facing direction is optimal in that it allows plenty of sunlight during the maximum part of the day for full sun growing of your food, and also a sloped south-facing slope can actually add latitude to your growing region. If you are in an area of a lower growing season, you can add BTUs, heat, and light with a south-facing slope. Not too steep, but sloping can be beneficial. And also a heat source. Wood is a great source of heat. It's a renewable resource, and it's one that you can access oftentimes for free. If you have other sources of heat, we had a pellet stove for some time, but that required a purchased product and power to actually run it. And so we shifted to a wood burning stove that could burn even in a power outage and of readily available materials. So some key components that we've taken from our quotes previously. You want to be able to be away from the cities, but able to work them, so not too far away. Should be secluded, not crowded together. So have some ample separation between homes, free from enemy interference, a little piece of land, so you could actually create enough food in the proper setting and space on a couple acres. 5 acres is a nice size. It's common, but you could do more than that. But there's more to take care of. So the main thing is you want to have capacity to grow a garden, have soil being fertile, and a space to do that. A place where you can cultivate simplicity and not have too complex of a life. A comfortable home. A retired place where there's fields, hills, and trees. And it can be inexpensive, and you may find great deals along the way. So one way that people can approach this is actually by renting in the place that they think they might like to go. As they look for property, get a feel for the area. It may not be the place that they ultimately will decide upon. And by renting, they haven't sunk great resources of time and investment into the place where they think they're going to go, and if it doesn't work out. So it could be a good starter way just to find a rental in a region or area that you think might be appropriate. So some other points to consider. Employment, if you're not retired. So think about your current work. Are you going to be commuting longer distance and maybe shorter? Telecommuting over the telephone or internet, maybe a different context, maybe house to house or a different trade. Are you going to be using an online type of connection for telecommuting? Do you have cable, fiber, satellite? What's going to work best for you? Maybe you can actually go into a different occupation than what you are currently in. Previous work experience, a new work experience, maybe become self-employed so you have more flexible hours, more flexible working area. Choose a niche business, which can sometimes be recession-proof, but also may have some other risks associated with it, but you may find a niche business that can work in your region or locality. And maybe even in the healthcare scenario or sector, could be a beneficial area. So lots of options in employment, but probably need to be creative about how that would be implemented. Some other points to consider: the southern exposure to the sun. You can see the diagram here. Solar gain can be a huge benefit in allowing the winter sun to help heat up your house in the winter, can reduce heating costs. Also allows the potential for solar power to be available, and also allow gardening success. So you want to have adequate southern exposure. Notice that they also have used skylights to increase indoor lighting, which is helpful in reducing the amount of electricity that's required to keep the room interior adequately lighted. Using a concrete floor can also function as a heating component if you do in-floor radiant heat, as well as a thermal cooling factor in the summertime if you are in a more warm climate. Shading by trees can be helpful, so do check shading. If they're deciduous trees, they can allow a solar gain through the winter and provide cooling elements in the summertime. So this is a very modern passive home, maximizing the benefits of southern exposure. You can see that there are both photovoltaic cells or solar panels on this house, and the 2 panels on the back roof are solar water heaters. So they actually help preheat the water or solely heat the water. You can see that in the diagram below, where they're using circulating water through the solar collectors on the roof to heat or preheat and aid the water heating system of this home's water source. So sometimes they may not look particularly inviting. This is a very kind of fairly extreme modern version of a passive solar house, but there are lots of different ways to incorporate various features. So when you're thinking about growing food, you want to think about the types of plants that you are wanting to grow, how much sun they require, and how much shade and sun is available. You may need to remove some trees, or you may have some ground that's already available. Some things that we were pretty excited about when we found our property was the fact that the house had a southern exposure. There were trees in the center, and then the north end of the property there was an open area that we've incorporated into a garden that has full sun. So you want to be observant about those kinds of things. How easy is it going to be able to actually implement and move into a gardening phase? So there are vegetables that require more sun than others. So most vegetables require 6 to 8 hours of full sun every day. Southern exposure, northern exposures will be shady and cooler and not get nearly as much sun. But there are shade-tolerant species and types of vegetables and plants too. Here are some shade-tolerant vegetables and fruits, just a list of various herbs, other vegetables, greens. So they do have some shade-tolerant capabilities, but you want to make sure that you have the option to have full sun as much as possible. So here's a spectrum. The sun is shading or shining from the south. The tree shades, just showing the shade factor. You need to have good sun for 12 hours at least for plants like eggplant, tomatoes, and corn. Other ones, beets and lettuce, can be much more shade tolerant. But think about those kinds of things when you're looking at the layout of your property. Potential property too. So you may want to think about where you are located as far as access to wild spaces, wilderness. This is a map that shows all the national forests and national grasslands in the United States. So it may be helpful to be directly adjacent to a place like this. So there's lots of space around you in addition to just the space that is owned by others. So public lands can be a great natural resource if you're able to have that as a direct access to your property. So when thinking about a place to locate, you can think about those types of spaces. So this is just national forest. There are other designated wild spaces as well. So this is looking at wilderness areas in addition to national parks and Forest Service areas. So this has an overlay in Washington State, and there are maps like this for lots of different locations. But the dark green are the wilderness areas, the gray are the national parks, and the light green are the national forests. So there are a variety of different wild spaces that are pre-set aside that won't be built on. And if you can get close to those, the closer proximity, the better in most cases. This is a county in California, just kind of drilling in a little bit closer to a potential place, just having a national forest and wilderness areas being shown. You can see where the towns are located and find locations of property that may be closer to those areas. So this is right near the Oregon-California border. But there are many places like this. Things to consider in this area would be potential for fire. It's a dry area, so you want to think about moisture and fire types of scenarios when you're thinking about property. So how much land? That kind of depends. You need to have enough land to have trees growing on it that could be used for firewood. Adequate place to have a garden. You may want some animals that would provide natural fertilizer, but 2 to 5 acres to 20 is a good size. but anywhere in between, depending on what you find available and the price point that is available for you. Utilities. What kind of utilities do you have or will you need? Will you need to put the power in, or is the power already present? Water. Is it running water? Do you need to have rainwater catchment system, or is there a well there already? Can you drill a well? Some places have restrictions on well drilling. And sewer. Do you have a sewer hookup, or you're going to need to have a percolation test for a septic system? Make sure the property passes a perk test where you want to build your home. Do you have garbage or internet access? You can make a trip to the dump. Do you need internet access? It may be simpler without it. So in places where you have water, you need to consider what that water is going to be like. You should take a drink of that water, see how it actually tastes. Is it good water? Have it tested. If you have to do extensive treating and testing of the water to make it safe or palatable, you may want to choose a different place. Check with the neighbors and see how deep their wells are, and see how deep the aquifer is that you need to access. On the same property, you can have a well that's shallow and one that's deep, so the aquifers can vary. Do you need to have close proximity to schools? Are you going to home educate? I know one family who chose, one of the criteria where they chose to move was based on a school for their children, but that may change as well. So, but at least you have that option available. How close do you want to be to where you can get supplies? You're going to be going to Home Depot or other building supply stores. You're going to need groceries of some nature, probably. And how is that going to be accessed for you? How far away do you want to be from those types of resources? So just things to consider as you plan and look at various potential properties. What are the lengths of the seasons? Are you okay with snow? What's the length of your growing season? Are you okay with rain? I grew up in Michigan, and we could have 3 months straight where there was no sun. So moving to the Pacific Northwest where we live now was not a stretch as far as sun exposure goes. But for some people moving from a sunny zone to a zone with more overcast periods of time can find that very difficult. So you may want to make sure that those factors are considered with your family members, because it is a family decision. It's not just an individual decision in most cases. So take those things into consideration. What are your high and low temperatures in the summertime and the wintertime? That can have an impact on your growing season. And the plant hardiness zones, that can also determine what types of plants you'll actually be able to grow. Are you part of a 911 dispatch zone? Fire, police, ambulance services? If not, you need to plan accordingly. Do you have proximity to medical care? How far away is it to the nearest emergency services? If you already have pre-existing medical conditions, you may want to take that into consideration. Some people live in an area where they actually subscribe to medical evacuation services that can get them to medical services if they live in a rather remote place with respect to medical services. What kind of terrain do you have? Is it steep? Is it full of ravines? Is it flat? Is there timber available? And what is the proximity of your neighbors? Are they close by? Are they far away, like a mile or half a mile or across the fence? And is that okay with you? Sometimes things change. We had a piece of property adjacent to us that was for sale when we purchased our property, and there's since been a house built on it a little closer than we would have preferred. But we prayed for those neighbors before they moved in, and are continuing to pray for them, that our witness may be one that is positive for them and for the kingdom of God. So keep in mind, the only perfect place is in heaven, and that we're just passing through this particular phase of our life, and we want to plan for our heavenly home and not consider our earthly home as being a permanent place. Because even though you do find a place in the country, at some point you will probably be obligated to leave everything behind, because we will be leaving everything behind for our heavenly home. So we need to be able to just be prepared to walk away. God will guide you as you lean on Him. So we need to lean on Him as Abraham did, and to be ready and preparing to be obedient and being obedient as we trust and build our trust in Him. What's good for you might be different for someone else. So keep that in mind, that what's a perfect scenario for one person may not fit another person. And that can be true within a family dynamic as well. So we need to negotiate together to how to best meet each other's needs within the finding of a country property. So again, you may move again. You may choose to rent in a particular locality first to get a better lay of the land and see if that's actually where you want to be. If you feel the obligation to move right away, rather than launching into the purchase of a piece of property, you may wish to rent in a region so you can have a better idea of microclimates, for example, or regional characteristics that you may choose to steer away from or move towards. So remember, again, heaven is our goal, and as ask God to place you where He sees best for you. We have nothing to fear, except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us, and His teaching in our past histories. History, Counsels for the Church, page 359.4. A great reminder that we need to build our trust in God now, in the little things, so that we can trust Him in the big things, ultimately with our life and the life to come. May God bless you as you seek to do His will.
Now that you know what kinds of things to look for in country property, now let's talk about how do you prioritize what you're looking for, because there is no perfect property. You will have to compromise some of your wants and wishes for reality. So what I'd like to suggest is, first of all, you're going to make that wish list. Take into consideration all of the factors that I talked to you about where, what, and now make them into a list. And that may take some time because you have to consider all the different ramifications. Then take that list and prioritize it so that the most important non-negotiable thing is at the top. Now you need to take into consideration other stakeholders in the mix of your family or relatives or people that you want to be part of this process. For instance, if you're alone, that makes it easy, but it's pretty hard then to do all the work that's needed on a country property if you're by yourself. Now, if you're a husband and wife, that's good. If you have kids, you need to take them into consideration. If you have extended family that's going to make the move with you, maybe you're pooling resources and combining families. Maybe the property will have 2 residences on it. So all these things need to be considered. So let's, for sake of example, say a nuclear family. You've got mom and dad, and you've got a couple of a grown child with a spouse. So you have 2 families that are going to make this move together. So each person has made a wish list and prioritized those lists. And the problem is they're not going to be the same. So the next step is to negotiate, if you will, between the 4 of you how to make a single combined priority list. And that means that the top priority for the father and the top priority for the mother and the top priority for the daughter and the top priority of the son-in-law all need to be at the top of the list, pretty close. Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. So hopefully with these tools that we have analyzed and talked about, you will be able to press forward with following the Lord's prompting of what you should do, when you should do it, how you should do it, why you should do it. And we pray that that will be your experience.